Hi, my name is Beatrice Rangel. I am a member of the Interamerican Institute for Democracy Board entrusted with international relations. On behalf of our board, I give you the warmest welcome to our Colloquium, Brazil, last bastion in the struggle against communism, whose keynote speaker is Luiz Philippe de Orléans and Bragança. From our headquarters, you are warmly welcomed by our President, Tomás Regalado, our Executive Director, Carlos Sánchez Berzaín, Rodrigo Berroso, Rodrigo Arboleda, Ricardo Israel, and Ambassador Armando Valladares, all board members. The Inter-American Institute for Democracy is a private non-profit organization whose objective is the promotion and dissemination of the values of freedom, democracy, human rights, and institutional development in the Americas. Its membership includes scholars, politicians, professionals, workers, entrepreneurs, men and women of different nationalities. It is a non-partisan think tank that achieves its goals by means of conducting academic research and organizing seminars, colloquia, and conferences in the context of pluralism and tolerance. Its editorial fund disseminates works that contribute to the support and defense of human rights, democracy, freedom, and institutional development. Today, we're summoned by a top-ranking matter that affects democracy in the hemisphere and particularly in Brazil. Brazil occupies 48% of the territory of South America. Its economy reached US 1.8 trillion last year in spite of the COVID pandemic. And it has infused new vitality. Its music has infused new vitality to all musical expression throughout the world, including classical music. It is therefore surprising that this nation has yet to consolidate a middle-class society with significant volumes of aggregate demand, with freedom for all and absolute respect for private property. In short, a liberal democracy. Today, despite these economic and cultural achievements, which are significant, because it is one of the three countries in the hemisphere with positive GDP growth during and after the pandemic, Brazil seems to be on the verge of experiencing a relapse towards socialism. And it is this situation that our guest will analyze today. Our guest is Luiz Philippe de Orléans and Bragança. Luiz Philippe de Orléans and Bragança is a Brazilian political scientist, activist, businessman, and in France, he is Prince de Orléans and Bragança. In 2019, took oath of office as federal deputy for the state of São Paulo, being elected in the general elections of 2018 by the Social Liberal Party. He's one of the leaders and co-founder of the liberal movement Acorda Brasil, which was favorable to impeachment of Dilma Rousseff, and the author of the book, Why is Brazil a Backward Country? What to do to enter the 21st century at once. To comment on Mr. de Orléans and Bragança, we have summoned a most distinguished panel, including Ambassador Ronald Douglas Johnson, who served as US Ambassador in El Salvador from 2019 to 2021. He was appointed ambassador by President Donald Trump in July the 3rd, 2019. At the time of his appointment, he was serving as the Central Intelligence Agency Science and Technology Liaison with the United States Special Operations Command based in Tampa, Florida. Johnson holds a Bachelor of Science from the State University of New York and a Master of Science from the National Intelligence University. We also have with us Tim Paget, an award-winning journalist who is the America's editor for Miami NPR affiliate WLRN, covering Latin America, the Caribbean, and their key relationship with South Florida. Paget has reported on Latin America for more than 30 years, including the Newsweek as his Mexico City bureau chief, and for Time Magazine as his Latin America and Miami bureau chief. From the end of the Central America Civil War to the current normalization of the US-Cuba relations, he has interviewed more than 20 heads of state. In 2005, Paget received the Columbia University Maria Moores Cabot Prize for his body of work in Latin America. In 2016, he won a national Edward R. Murrow Award for the radio series, The Migration Maze, about the brutal causes of Central American immigration. We have also Carlos Sanchez Versain, former Minister of Government of Bolivia. He has a master's in political science and a master in sociology. He's a political scientist, founding member of the Bolivian Legal Athenaeum, professor of constitutional law and public international law, columnist in several media in the region, such as Envoy. He's the author of several books, the most recent one presented at this institute in December 2020, as is entitled Offensive of Castro Chavismo, Aggression to Democracy. We also have a board member, Ricardo Israel, who is a very distinguished scholar. He was also a candidate, he ran for the presidency of Chile in the past 5 years. Before giving the floor to our president, Tomás Regalado, I would like to take on some housekeeping affairs. The keynoter will have between 10 and 15 minutes to present his ideas. The commentators will have between 5 and 7 minutes to comment. I shall keep the time, and I will let you know when you only have 1 minute left to finish your presentation. Now I will invite our president, a distinguished journalist, most loved mayor of Miami for 2 terms, Tomás Regalado, to give the welcoming remarks.
Thank you, Beatrice, and good morning to all. We have here a member of Congress. We also have ambassadors. And what we're doing here today, it's like a warning flag for those who every single week are connected through the Interamerican Institute for Democracy's forums, because we want to get ahead of the problem. And Brazil is one of the most important issues that this institute needs to address. And we have the right person to do it. And we have the right speakers to follow up. Brazil is important for Latin America. Brazil is important for the United States. Brazil is more important for democracy in this hemisphere. And actually, Brazil is one of the most important single countries for South Florida and the greater Miami area. We depend on Brazil for tourism, for commerce, and relations. So it is with great honor that we are here welcoming the member of Congress, Luiz Philippe de Orléans and Bragança, member of Congress on Brazil from São Paulo, a person who, by the way, when he leaves Miami, will not be going back to Brazil, but going to the Organization of American States to state the case of Brazil. We hope that these forums will bring information, will bring hope to many of those who are connected now throughout the Latin American continent. And we also hope that in the case of Ambassador Valladares, he wrote a book many years ago when he was in prison called No One Was Listening. So today, we hope that everybody is listening to what this important member of Congress in Brazil has to say. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Now, it is with great pleasure that I am going to introduce and give the floor to Luiz Philippe de Orléans and Bragança. Luiz Philippe de Orléans and Bragança is a Brazilian politician, scientist, activist, businessman, and in France, the Prince of Orléans and Bragança. Luiz Philippe, the floor is yours.
Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me, all the members of the Inter-American Institute for Democracy. I feel very prestigious in being here, very honored to be here. It's the second time I'm addressing you with similar issues, yet here we are, the time has passed and the problem has only become bigger and more challenging. So that you understand more or less the context of how I see Latin America, how I see the countries of Latin America in the context of political evolution in the 21st century. I will actually have an analogy made to a previous period of time in a different continent in Europe, when the Moorish empires invaded the Iberian Peninsula. There they found fertile land, they found a fragmented and weak local regimes, local monarchies, and they quickly succumbed to a violent proposal. Either you adopt the Muslim faith or you die, literally. So the conquering of the Iberian Peninsula was very quick and with a very forthright and tremendous power in their narrative. The traditional values of the Christianity had to resort to escape to a very small place in the north of the Iberian Peninsula called the Asturias. There they formed a new government and coalition that required 200 years to reconquer the Iberian Peninsula with wars of reconquista. So I think that we're in a similar process in Latin America, where we've been overridden by a very strong narrative, a very strong presence of powers that rely mostly on, not on political power, not on convincing, but also on criminal powers, like narco powers, and also terrorists that terrorize the whole region. So the traditional values of the Latin American people have receded to a very small place. Thankfully, the small place is actually a big country, Brazil. Yet, even in Brazil, we don't have a total control over what's going on politically. We have elected a conservative representative to the presidency of Brazil. We have elected a few congressmen like myself to represent conservative values and the values of the atemporal values of the Latin America, or at least the Brazilian people. Yet we do not command the country, and the agenda is still being implemented via the media, via the universities, via part of the congressmen that also still believe in the models of the 20th century. However, in the 21st century, we're witnessing that the model of the 20th century, which was a state-run economy, a state-influenced control over society, a welfare state, a very aggressive welfare state was implemented in Brazil over the 100 years of the 20th century. And in the beginning of the 21st century, reforms of every sort were needed to stabilize or to restabilize Brazil due to the fallacy of the welfare state and of the social state, as they call it. So this is the prognosis. Are we still going to maintain the utopia view of a welfare state, a very aggressive welfare state, or are we soon to liberalize our economy and to reduce the size and the influence of the state-run economy, society, and politics? It's very important for us to note that most countries that have adopted an aggressive welfare state with a presidential system, they are poor countries. In the name of social justice, in the name of equality, in the name of many premises of helping the people, they end up succumbing society into almost a slave relationship between society and the state, where society becomes dependent on the state and the state becomes the master of society and the economy. Freedom ceases to exist in ecosystems like that. Brazil is no exception. This is the challenge that most conservatives have in Latin America, not really controlling the system, yet putting forth a very strong presence in the commanding presence of our president and also of many congressmen. They came to create a different narrative. They came to reintroduce perhaps the beginning of a new reconquista of Brazil and maybe help our Latin American friends in re-achieving their sovereignty. Why is sovereignty, am I mentioning sovereignty here as a problem? because back in the 90s, in the beginning of the 90s, a criminal organization made up by socialist parties gathered together in what they called Foro of São Paulo, Foro de São Paulo. Their objectivity was very clear. They wanted to establish a region-wide socialist control. They put forth whatever they needed to do in order to elect socialist presidents. And they succeeded in many cases. Actually, most of the regions succumbed to socialism, from Mexico all the way down to Argentina and Chile, Brazil included. For many years, these countries witnessed what it is to be under a socialist regime, or at least a growing influence of socialism within society and the organizations and so forth. Brazil, as well as many other countries, had a, what can we call it, a breath of fresh air during the past 5 to 10 years, where many of these socialist regimes were challenged by important counter narratives and important mobilizations of these peoples in order to form new and disruptive conservative governments. However, we're now witnessing a new backlash of challenge, a more aggressive backlash of this system that was implemented over the 90s and the initial of the first 20 years of this century. And this backlash is very strong. They not only command the media, they command the universities and students, they still command a lot of the politicians, the bureaucracy, but most importantly, they command the electoral system. It is very important to understand that the electoral system in all these countries have been suffering a lot of interference by different types of narratives and destroying a more transparent model, in place a more electronic, intransparent model. Obviously, it's in the name of transparency, in the name of efficiency, in the name of many of these attributes falsely claimed to be the ones that they're upholding, that they implement these electoral systems. So the challenge is, how do we go forward if their control on the electoral process becomes complete, which is signalizing to be, I think, what elected me and what elected the current president of Brazil and many other congressmen, was the fact that they understood that they couldn't control, even in a country like Brazil, because of its size, because of its diversity, because of the volume of different states and electoral colleges. It is very difficult for you to control, even if you do have control of an electronic electoral process. However, they're refining that control, and that becomes a real challenge. Now, what is behind all this? The Foro of São Paulo is still active. It is now re-engaging in a more aggressive level. And if you look at the countries as what you see as far as their state organization and what really commands power, a growing power is not socialism or conservatism. The growing power in Latin America is the narco-traffickers, is the narco state. That is the growing power that is overriding any type of ideology. You cannot even implement socialism, as Mexico has proven, by electing a socialist president. However, he had to bow to the power of the narco-traffickers in releasing one of the most wanted criminals for narco trafficking in that country to the narco-traffickers themselves. So they pose the power within the power. They pose a state within the state. And that is subverting every single institution in Latin America. Some countries are able to fight that, like Brazil, I think, is commanding at least some control over its country, but not convincingly winning this war. Some states have succumbed to narco traffickers, yet others are still maintaining a facade of real institutions. But other countries have succumbed to the narco traffickers, like Venezuela, and maybe even, I'm not wanting to put forth here some speculation, but our impression is that other countries like Bolivia is also succumbing to the power of narco traffickers, and their influence is also being legitimized by many political parties. Now, they're considered to be an oligarchy to command all this region. Yet there are other oligarchies that are at play. There are many oligarchies, especially from other countries like China, that are interested in command and control of natural resources, also of the agricultural produce from Brazil, becoming, since Brazil is one of the largest contributors to feeding the Chinese peoples, and also oligarchies regarding the financial sector. They also understand and they own a lot of assets in the region. So there are many oligarchies at play here in the command of Brazil specifically and Latin American region. However, Brazil is the only country that has not succumbed entirely yet to those oligarchies. It's still putting up a fight. That's why it is the last bastion. The new version of communism that is putting forth in Latin American region, it's not the communism that we saw in the 20th century, where you have the total command of the means of production and the total ownership of the means of production in the hands of the state. You don't need to have that if you control the electoral process. You don't need to have that if you control via regulations all the assets and via taxation what everybody can do or can have and accumulate. So it's a new form of communism where you have a centralized control, still have central planning, yet with technology, there's a new version of social control and of the economics control and of political control that can be implemented. And that is the new version that we're witnessing being implemented and even put forth by many political parties in Brazil openly. So you're creating even popular support to those ideas. So this is the challenge that Latin America faces right now. And what can we do? Well, understanding that these are the challenges and how the communists have acted in the 21st century, at least in the 20th century, the conservative majority which exists in Brazil, we have to understand that our mission is to curtail that ability to create a dictatorship. We have to curtail that ability to create a despotic system. How do we do that? Understanding that within the 20th century, communists have influenced many of the European countries and Latin American countries to change their constitution and to become a welfare state, implement a lot of the socialist pillars of assistantialism, of labor laws, of a centralized controlled social security system, of unified health system, of an educational system that is also state-run and state-controlled. All of these are pillars of the socialist regimes that were implemented in the region in the constitution, and Brazil is no exception. So if we have a conservative majority that wants to protect the idea of freedom, the idea that the state is not supposed to run the lives of its citizens as an individuals and influence disproportionately on the lives and the welfare of the individuals and the future of the country. It's not via a dictatorship that we're going to achieve that. Then we need to put forth constitutional reform. All of Brazil and also many of the other countries have to understand that there is a need to get away from the welfare state, social state that was created in the 20th century and reintroduce constitutional reform in the 21st century. Now, as maybe this is unheard of, being led by conservative forces, which has never happened, yet it is of utmost importance and it is feasible of doing. So the focus and the conscientiousness of Latin American peoples is that they need to embark in constitutional reforms in order to avoid that the whole region fall within a autocratic centralized planning system, which is the idea. It's trying to create a Soviet Union of Latin America. This is their plans is very vocal, it's very present, and they are achieving now in the short run. They have achieved another victories that put them also back in the path of creating the centralized control. How can the United States and the conservatives in the United States help? First is understanding the problem. I think that is of utmost importance. And even in Brazil, many Brazilians don't understand this as being a problem, which is a problem in itself. Second is to understand that unlike the United States that have a very solid constitution and protects it, and the Americans should protect their constitution the way it is and not really embark in any utopian ideas of changing it. Not only that, it's promoting that Latin America that succumbed to the socialist movement of the 20th century and changed their constitution, leads to change back their constitution into something less intrusive, less despotic, and that is only favorable to those that want more command and control. This is the challenge of Latin America. This is why I'm here. I appreciate the time. I appreciate the help in getting this word across. Thank you very much for everyone for the attention. Thank you.
Now I am going to invite our board member, Ricardo Israel, to comment on the remarks made by Mr. de Orléans and Bragança.
I was listening. I try to be in time, just a minute. Okay. And when I was listening to you, I remember what Henry Kissinger said once, that international politics is mostly internal politics. Kissinger was speaking of Israel, and at the same time, his effort to change United States in the respect in which was successful to the advantage of China, as we know. But I believe that also applies to Brazil. And this is very unfortunate for Latin America. Brazil has a strong history in the region. And this expression of Kissinger applies to his hard power, almost half of the region, but also to his soft power. Brazil has the potential, similar to the United States, to exert a very strong soft power in all the region. And I would say in all this Portuguese-speaking world, as it was proved, Brazil in Africa. But unfortunately, it's not exercising its power. The soft power of Brazil, if we look how strong is his culture industry, his television, his cinema, really does not apply as it should be. Because what we're witnessing in the region, and I fully agree in that respect, is not only political and ideological war, it's also and mostly a cultural war. There are two visions of the past. Just reflect on all this debate, not only in Latin America, also in this country, about Christopher Columbus of the past, of history. But the consequence is two completely different visions of the future as a consequence. Today, for instance, China, as a consequence of decisions taken last century, poses completely different questions, including the geopolitical ones. It's a challenge to which I am convinced that the United States, as it happened with Great Britain, with the rising of the United States, seems to be without the will. This is why I particularly regret that does not apply to the region. Brazil, all its potential in power, being the hard power, but mostly, which was exercised together with Chile in 80, for instance, but not the soft power. Brazil is needed today, I believe, for a second reason. The United States has lost completely interest in the region, not only to the advantage of China. It has lost the interest for a long time, even before Obama, in all respects, but only two: drugs and illegal immigration. The problem that Latin America as a region has very little to say, because the region requested the United States not to intervene and has done absolutely nothing in that respect. Not even the region support the United States when applies sanctions to no repressors and delinquents of Latin American countries, but for Panama. The request, Latin America did nothing, and this is why I miss very much the power of Brazil. It's a situation characterized by an increasing number of dictatorships in the region, and not traditional dictatorship, and not military dictatorship. The region is prepared to react immediately to military dictatorship, has done nothing to this increasing number of Castro Chavez dictatorships. The ideological challenge, not only today of the Foro São Paulo, after the political change in Brazil, rapidly the Foro São Paulo moved to Mexico, and it's called today the Foro of Puebla. It's not the old Marx. We don't realize this but there are two Marx. There was a Marx, the young Marx, who wrote against the society of his time, exactly the same type of criticism that we witness today. It's a Marx that was not yet Marxist. He has not developed the idea that characterized and produced the fall of the Soviet Union. It's one who was very articulate in criticizing the society of his time. Before he became a Marxist, he was very articulate. And if we look at the type of revolution, the type of what's happening, the way that the electorate is behaving in many of our countries, you find, with other names, the same idea. He only criticized the society of his time, but as many revolutions that we are witnessing today did not produce the proposal of a new model. The most important fact to mention is not one. They are two and completely linked, one with the other, not one instead of the other. One is the power of drugs. I'm sure that in this catastrophic withdrawal of the United States from Afghanistan, everyone was realizing the same that is happening today in the possibility of a civil war in Afghanistan. It's also a country taken by drugs, not only by a religious ideology, it's the power of drugs everywhere. The United States in the 20 years had to accept that reality, and the production here increased instead of decreasing. It's the reality. It's the reality of our country. And this reality has produced government who are not only dictatorship, are government taken by international delinquency. And this is a new fact which was not witnessed in the previous type of dictatorships in the region, was not witnessed with military government, but is today the most important fact in the region because of the type of resources that are used. It's also a cultural and ideological war, and we witness the following problems. Sorry, I have to finish. The main problem that you see, and it's very powerful, the situation today in the danger posed to the survival of democracy in Colombia and Chile, that Democrats are cornered. They don't come out as it happened when they were fighting the Soviet Union. And this is why we need the United States. And as the United States doesn't seem to be rising to the challenge, we need Brazil today, because our dictatorship who arrived to power, supported by the people, our electoral dictatorship, they take over the institutions, and without this realizing that we are also fighting for the survival of democracy. The only one, the one is governed in the Interamerican Charter, the one is international law. There is no way to confront this, because in this cultural and ideological challenge, they propose a type of democracy with a last name, being the 21st century and so on. And the only one real democracy, the one who comes from the Greeks, who was recovered for the world because it disappeared for centuries by the American Revolution and the American Constitution. And this has no last name, it's just democracy. So more than ever, we need Brazil. Thank you.
Indeed, we need a new regional leadership, and it should come from Brazil. I agree with you. But also we could start another discussion about March before and after the 18 Brumaire, which would take hours and hours and hours. So now I'm going to give the floor to Ambassador Ron Johnson. Welcome, Ambassador Johnson. Thank you for being with us.
Let me begin by just saying it's great to hear this point of view from another young Christian conservative. And I know several of you look shocked because you're right, I'm not young, but I am a Christian and I am conservative. So if you go back and you look at the Bible tells us, whether you're a Christian or not, a historical document, the Bible tells us that as Christians, we will be persecuted. And if you look at modern social media, it tells us that as conservatives, we will be persecuted. It's just a fact of life that we deal with today. And yet I would say that as Christian conservatives, we are probably the most socially liberal people on earth. We are tolerant of other people's beliefs. So think about that the next time you hear some self-proclaimed liberals screaming at the top of their lungs about how conservatism is wrong and conservative voices must be silenced. They shouldn't be silenced. So I want to stop there for just a moment and thank the Inter-American Institute for Democracy for hosting today's event. Beatrice, thank you so much for your job as a facilitator. I know it's difficult sometimes with us. And I want to thank you, Philippe, for sharing your insights, your unique insights with us here today. I share your beliefs in empowering individual people and local communities more than the central government, especially central governments in large countries, because over time, those governments tend to grow bigger, they tend to become more powerful, and they become self-serving. They're egocentric bureaucracies that are more concerned with preserving their own power than they are helping the people that they're supposed to be serving. And unfortunately, the common scheme for that is to preserve that power by putting the people that they're supposed to be serving in a position where they are dependent on the government or as their primary provider for their basic needs. And I mean security, law enforcement, healthcare, education, their infrastructure, and finally, even their retirement. This, of course, kills the spirit of the individual, the entrepreneur, the investor, the risk taker. It kills the idea of self-determination, self-improvement, and the incentive to study hard and work harder in order to accomplish more. That is one of the basic foundations of democracy. Regarding communism, the world should remember communism has been tried in many places and it has failed every single time. The most well-known case is, of course, the failure of the Soviet Union and its collapse, but it's failed everywhere, even in the countries where it is currently being practiced, like, for example, communist China. I believe in many ways, China's economy is more capitalistic today than it is communist. In these countries, communist countries, where socialism is their form of the economy, you think about it, the people, the majority of the population is asked to contribute to the society, contribute to the nation. And what occurs is that a few people in the elite ruling class tend to divide up their proceeds off the top of what the nation produces. And then what's left, the remainder, the crumbs, we might say, are divided equally among the rest of the population. So I would argue that the nation's wealth is not shared equally, but its poverty certainly is shared equally. That's the same case in Cuba that we see today. A government that is involved in every aspect of Cuban life, but a government that has trouble feeding its own people and caring for its own people. While the Castros and a few of the communist elite enjoy the life of the rich and famous. And I'll mention Venezuela, a nation that is by many accounts one of the most wealthy nations in the Western Hemisphere. Maybe not as rich as Brazil, but in terms of natural resources, a very wealthy nation, and yet a nation that's currently in ruins, a nation where over 13% of their population have left, a nation where hunger is typical, and yet a nation where the president is overweight. Think about that the next time you look at it. And I want to comment on socialism. Socialism tends to be on the rise, or at least the discussion of socialism is on the rise across the world. Even in the United States, we have politicians who now publicly admit that they're socialist. I never thought I would see that happen in my lifetime, but it's here. It's here today. So what's the difference between socialism and communism? There is a difference, at least academically there is. Communism means everything is owned by the government. And socialism means every citizen owns everything equally. Everything that is owned or produced by society will be shared equally. Frankly, that concept is utopia. It's heaven on earth. And perhaps that's why humankind will never perfect it. In any society, someone has to make decisions about how things will be shared, about how money will be spent, and about what is and what is not a priority. And if you look at things, even things as simple as some of the TV shows that we see in the United States now, like Naked and Afraid or like Lost, what you see is the decisions are made to benefit the decision maker. That's human nature, and that's what we will see all over the world, no matter where we go from here. I think the other thing that has contributed a lot to the talk of socialism is the lack of respect and trust in governments that we see today. And COVID-19 has contributed a great deal to that, because we didn't know a lot about this pandemic when it started. I would argue we still don't know a lot about this pandemic. And the fact that our governments, the people we look to give us advice and tell us what we should do to protect ourselves against COVID, have consistently changed over and over again. Wear masks, don't wear masks, get a vaccine, maybe not. Vaccines are mandatory. You can travel, but you have to wear a mask on an airplane, but you can take your mask off to eat food. I mean, all of these things sort of contradict their scientific purpose, and that causes mistrust. And I think that mistrust leads to a mistrust of all governments and all authority. And we've even seen people talking lately about this concept that a lot of our population, especially our young people, tend to just be opposed to anything the government is for. They're against everything because they don't trust the government, and they assume that the government is there to serve the elite and not the people that they were elected to serve. So I'll stop there, but I want to thank the Inter-American Institute for Democracy again. And Philippe, thank you so much for your words.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Johnson. Now we're going to invite to the podium Tim Paget, an award-winning journalist and the authoritative voice on Latin America that we hear every morning on National Public Radio. Tim, please.
Thank you very much, Beatrice, and the Inter-American Institute for Democracy for the invitation to take part in this. Thank you very much, Congressman, for your speech and your perspectives on Brazil. They were very, very interesting, and I think one of the reasons Beatrice probably invited me here was to maybe be a little bit of a contrarian voice, a little bit of a devil's advocate, which every panel needs. And as a journalist, I'm always more than happy to play that role. There were many things in your speech, Congressman, particularly regarding Brazil that I agreed with. I am one of the biggest critics of Brazil's monstrous bureaucracy, for example. The fact that it takes 4 months to start a business in Brazil as compared to a matter of days or weeks in so many other democracies around the world. And I will always be the first to as a journalist, to condemn the far left abuses that we see in Latin America, whether it's Nicaragua with Daniel Ortega, whether it's what's happening right now in Peru under Pedro Castillo, and certainly under Venezuela. My wife is Venezuelan. I have family in Venezuela, and in my work, I'm a severe critic of what the Chavistas have done there. But again, as a journalist and as a bit of that devil's advocate, I think one of my biggest concerns, professionally and personally, is to ask the question, what causes these regimes to come to power in the first place? And I know that's something Beatrice and I often talk about, and we've often talked about it in the context of Venezuela. As much as I condemn what the Chavistas have done, I often ask myself, what brought Chavez to power in the first place? He just didn't come down, you know, as a Grendel from Mount Avila. You know, I mean, there were reasons, and I often have this debate with conservatives, for example, when I used to go to Caracas, and we'd be sitting at restaurants like the Limoncello in Chacao, trying to understand, you know, what brought Chavez to power, and I think one of the most interesting points of your speech, Congressman, and that I very much agreed with, was that perhaps it's more useful to look at this problem not so much in terms of ideological, the ideological spectrum, but in terms of the point you made about narco-terrorism today, narco cartels, narco organizations, and the criminal organizations that seem to have just taken over so much of Latin America, whether it's the Maras in the northern triangle of Central America, or the Cartel de los Soles in Venezuela. And I think the point that you made about the narco situation in Latin America and how it's taken over brings us to one of the biggest points that I always try to make about what brings abusive left-wing regimes to power in Latin America. And I think that's why I'm focused, perhaps as a journalist, not so much on the C word communism as I am on the C word corruption. And I think when we're looking at the problem of abusive left-wing regimes in Latin America, we have to look at that word, corruption, because that's what so often makes Latin American voters turn to extremist leftists like Pedro Castillo, as we've just seen recently in Peru. And my point is, you know, why did we just before Pedro Castillo, why did we have 5 presidents in 5 years there? Why were so many of them having to resign? Well, because of corruption scandals like Odebrecht. What was one of the big things that brought Pedro Castillo? I mean, this obscure left-wing Marxist teacher from the Andes in Peru. What was it that elevated him so suddenly in Peru and during the pandemic? Well, a lot of that was the fact that, for example, what made the pandemic so bad in Peru was the fact that Peru has the lowest level of healthcare spending as a share of GDP in all of South America. And that became accentuated, that problem, during the pandemic, and it made people very angry. And suddenly they shift their focus to a guy like Pedro Castillo. 70% of them still work in the informal economy. I look at Peru and I wonder why conservatives, for example, haven't adopted more of the ideas of a thinker like Hernando de Soto, who wrote why am I forgetting the mysteries? I'm sorry. No, but the other one, my favorite of him is yeah, I'm sorry, it'll come to me. But his basic point is, how do we bring these people out of the informal economy into the formal economy in Latin America so that they become tax-paying citizens with titles in their houses, and as long as they're in that subterranean economy, people like Pedro Castillo perhaps are going to be more attractive to them. I know Colombia is a huge concern right now. And I ask I'm no fan of particularly of Gustavo Petro either, but I have to ask myself as a journalist, why suddenly are so many Colombian voters, according to polls, turning to him? It's largely one of the big reasons is because you still have a very tiny fraction of Colombian land ownership in just a very tiny fraction of landowners' hands. And I mean, essentially the reasons that brought us to a civil war 6 decades ago in Colombia still really haven't been resolved. And again, I think, corruption often has a very large role in playing that, especially in Brazil. And again, I don't know if that's really a left-wing problem or a right-wing problem. I think in Brazil, it's it's both, because we can blame the PT for Lava Jato, for example, but conservatives like Eduardo da Cunha certainly were very responsible for Lava Jato as well. Both left and right in Brazil, I think, are responsible for the fact that corruption eats up 5% of Brazil's $2 trillion GDP. And I think, as a journalist, just offering my perspective as a journalist, we tend to look at this less as an ideological issue, as more of an institutional issue. The development of democratic institutions in countries like Brazil that can fight a problem like, as I said, corruption that eats up that much a percentage of a country's GDP. And so again, I agree with your points that abusive left-wing regimes are very, very much a problem today. Venezuela, Nicaragua, Cuba, the troika of tyranny, as President Trump, and now with Peru, et cetera. But again, going to your point about narco-terrorism, I think we can't look at it just as narrowly as a problem that applies to the left. I look at Honduras, Juan Orlando Hernandez, a right-wing, a conservative president who our own government has essentially fingered as being an accomplice to narco-terrorists in the northern triangle of Central America. So again, I do agree with your point that we have to be on the lookout for how these abusive left-wing regimes come to power, but I also think that we have to look at what is the underlying problem that helps bring them to power in the first place. And again, I look not so much at the C word communism as I do the C word corruption. And I appreciate you very much then making that point about the narco-criminal organizations, because they're one of the biggest causes of that corruption. Well, Odebrecht too, maybe, I don't know, but they're one of the biggest causes of that. And I think, so your point is very, very well taken, and I'm very glad you made it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. Now we're going to invite to the podium Carlos Sanchez Ferzain, the Executive Director of the Interamerican Institute for Democracy, for his remarks.
Thank you for coming, Luiz Philippe. Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you very much for your comments. Thank you to our directors. I have just a few notes about the presentation. Luiz Philippe's approach and explanation is very important for us because it differentiates politics from organized crime. In my opinion, this is the issue. In the Americas from 1999, when Chavez go to rescue Fidel Castro, if you remember, in 1999, America has just one dictatorship, is Cuba. And now, 21 or 20 years after, we have dictator in Cuba, Venezuela, Bolivia, and Nicaragua. And the whole region is under pressure from this group. The 21st century is a dispute from two Americas, the democracy and the dictatorship. The dictatorship is organized crime. This is the issue, is the principal. And about this, the Interamerican Institute for Democracy has many works in our editorial fund. The institutional destruction in Argentina. This is made from Castro-Chavism, from socialism from 21st century. The 21st century dictatorship from our director Osvaldo Hurtado describes the process that Chavez and Castro expand the Castro doctrine in Americas. And the 21st century dictatorship in Bolivia. Now Bolivia is a dictator, but came with flags of democracy. Bolivia has 52 political prisoners now, and the community is looking about the justice crisis in Bolivia. It's not justice crisis, it's a dictator with that dictatorship. And in addition, it's a narco state. Same to Venezuela, same to Nicaragua, same to Cuba. Cuba is the big chief of this criminal organization. I have a vital words about the problem in the Americas. First one, Cuba. This is the problem, is Cuba. 62 years now with the 62 years with his dictator, but 21 or 22 years with the Castro Chavism. This is the new concept from the union, the Castro with Chavez. The other words is dictatorships. The other words is narco states. In Latin America has 4 or 5 narco states now. And Peru is under this pressure. The idea from the Castro Chavez is expands the Bolivian narco state to the Peruvian narco state. And it's working in this work now. The other word is organized crime, justice manipulation. And the final is, this problem is no political status is crime. Thank you for your works, Luiz Philippe, and thank you for your efforts in defending Brazil and the Latin America from the organized crime. Our work is different, is separate, the organized crime and the political. You are political. The organized crime is in Venezuela, Bolivia, Cuba, Nicaragua, maybe in Argentina and Mexico now, with the governments that are a servidum to the dictatorship, the Castro Chavez.
Well, we
Just
thank
remember the name of the book, Ministry of Capital.
the Ministry of Capital by Hernando. So Tim recommends that we read the Ministry of Capital by Hernando de Soto. Thank you, Tim. Well, and now before we close, we have a question that wants to be posed to Luiz Philippe from a very distinguished journalist who's now an independent journalist who goes after organized crime. He did a very successful and extensive career in the Miami Herald, but now he's working on the research of organized crime. I'm going to welcome Castro Canto to pose the question to our guest.
Thank you. You have to do it in the mic. Okay, thank you for the opportunity. I was interested in your when you say that there is a huge risk of drug trafficking money, and like infiltrating the political systems in Latin American countries. So, do you see in the case of Brazil, drug money like infiltrating the political realm of in Brazil? And because you mentioned maybe there is a connection, I would like you to be a little bit more specific on how, I mean, if there is any connection between drug trafficking money and the photo de Sao Paulo, and if we're going to see in the next elections, drug money, like, financing political parties in Brazil. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a very practical question. And the answer, unfortunately, is yes. The narco traffickers, the narco terrorist organizations in Brazil, the largest one is PCC, Primeiro Comando da Capital. It's part of it's the local, if you can call it local, Brazil being continental, but it's the main narco trafficking organization in Brazil. It's related to the other narco trafficking organizations of Latin America. And they literally not only finance political agendas from individual politicians, they finance political parties considering that most of the elections in Brazil, considering the size and the territory, are very expensive. And public funding is being directed towards that, yet the model is not very appropriate for that. I don't believe in public financing of elections. And many regulations have been passed to limit funding of political campaigns. Yet via the narco-traffickers, you have a free flow of cash to political campaigns, and they end up representing those issues. So that's one extent. I'm talking about legislative power. As far as executive power, which is even more expensive for you to elect a mayor of a large city or a governor of an important state, there's even more cash that is necessary to be dispensable on these campaigns. So they are present there. Many of the security secretaries of some governments, they are appointed by, or at least have the influence of the narco-trafficking organization. So they command, at least they create the limitation there on security issues that would affect them. The narco-traffickers also command the president, state-run penitentiaries, because they command, that's their commanding post. We have laws and rights of those that should be in jail. They actually, how would I say it? Once you get arrested and you're condemned, you earn rights, and you start earning a salary inside the jail system. And the jail system in Brazil is like almost like a spa. So you're really not paying for or not being punished for your crimes. You're there for some time, and then you're going to be released again. And that time is going to be financially rewarded. This is as a function of laws and regulations created by the left-wing parties, yes, in the name of human rights. So our penitential system is probably one of the best, most agreeable systems for the criminals in the world. It's very, it's almost like a rite of passage for many criminals in Brazil. But anyway, so there's politicians, there's political parties, there's executive power, and most importantly, there are judges, not only local judges on the state level, but also federal judges that enact laws in order to favor the narco-traffickers. Right? Currently, one judge specifically in Brazil, he prohibited flybys from the police that would be monitoring the favelas as far as organized crime is concerned. He prohibited that any helicopter would do a flyby in a region where narco-traffickers own it. So in other words, it sort of reducing the monitoring of what's going on. Also, he prohibited any how would I say it in English, vistoriamento, any oversight of imports that would be coming for these narco-traffickers in that region. So he's basically building an army of criminals and making sure that that army is uncontested by the formal powers of Brazil. So what does that mean? It means that some states of Brazil already succumbed to the narco-traffickers to the extent that they infiltrated and subverted, very much like communist infiltration and subversion. If you study Marxism and the evolution of Marxism and communist regimes over the 20th century, the key aspect for a communist revolution is not chaos, is not social unrest. The key aspect of a revolution towards communism is subversion, is the infiltration within the bureaucracy and the institutions, and basically getting rid of their ability to act against these organizations that work against society in favor of creating or demoralizing the current power and putting a new power there that is more favorable towards this shady organization. So infiltration is the key that we need to fight in Brazil. So that is the issue. And many states that have weak institutions, they already succumb, especially those that are near the border, like Acre is one of the states in the north of Brazil. Also in the north of Brazil is Roraima. is being invaded now by many Venezuelans because of many of the Venezuelan crisis. Amapá is also in the northern state, and Rio de Janeiro is famous for being a very rich state, yet the infiltration on all organizations in the judiciary system, in the electoral system, in the executive powers of many of the mayors and governors. I think it's the state that contributed the most amount of governors that were arrested for corruption scandals and favoring these shady oligarchies that exist in the state. So it is possible to do it even in a rich state in Brazil. So we're, if you look at Brazil as an individual, a human being, it's a human being with skin cancer in a few areas. So it doesn't control the whole. It's not yet omnipresent, but it's there. So hopefully we'll recover. So that's the idea. Thank you.
And with this, we have come to an end of our program today. We thank our guest speaker, Luiz Philippe de Orléans and Bragança. We thank our guest also, Ambassador Johnson, Tim Paget, and the comments of our board member, Ricardo Israel, and our executive director, Carlos Sanchez Berzain. We'll see you soon. Thank you for following us and for being a very, very loyal audience. Thank you.